The sound cracked through the chamber like a whip. Stacey Abrams' palm slammed against the table, her voice slicing through the air. "Get out!" The room froze. Conversations died mid-whisper. Papers hung in trembling hands, and the weight of her command pressed on every corner of the space. Gasps broke the silence, scattered and sharp as though the audience couldn't decide whether to be shocked, outraged, or awed by the sheer force of it. Eyes darted to Jasmine Crockett. Surely they thought she would recoil, stumble, or erupt. But Crockett did none of these things. Instead, she sat still. Her shoulders didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't waver. Her silence, deliberate and unshaken, seemed to grow louder than the outburst itself. The tension stretched like a held breath. Abrams had meant to seize control, to remind everyone of her authority with a thunderclap command. Instead, her own. Fury had cast a spotlight onto her opponent. The room's focus shifted, not to the woman who shouted, but to the one who did not. A murmur began to ripple through the audience. Some leaned forward, their curiosity piqued, waiting to see if Crockett would rise or lash back. Others whispered nervously, sensing that this was no ordinary clash of words, but something deeper, a collision of wills, identity, and power. Crockett's gaze stayed steady, fixed on Abrams, her silence a mirror that reflected every ounce of aggression back onto its source. It was not the reaction Abrams expected. It was not the reaction anyone expected. And in that moment, the dynamics of the room began to shift. A silence that had begun as shock transformed into suspense. Everyone wondered the same thing but dared not say it aloud. How would Jasmine Crockett respond to being told to leave, not just by a political powerhouse, but by one of the most commanding voices in Democratic politics? The question lingered, like electricity in the air, sparking curiosity, sparking doubt. Abrams had thrown down the gauntlet with fire. Crockett had answered with composure. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and it set the stage for a confrontation no one had anticipated. But what happened next left even Abrams' strongest allies speechless. This wasn't just a spat. It wasn't simply one politician snapping at another in a heated exchange. What played out in that room was something far bigger, far heavier. It was a battle over who gets to belong in politics and who gets pushed to the margins when they refuse to fit into someone else's mold. For years, Stacey Abrams had been celebrated as the embodiment of Democratic power and persistence. She was the strategist who flipped Georgia blue, the queenmaker who carried candidates on her shoulders, the woman who became a national symbol of organizing brilliance. Her presence commanded respect, her voice could tilt the direction of a debate, and her story was etched into the party's memory as one of resilience and influence. So when Abrams slammed her hand and barked her command, it wasn't just her authority speaking, it was the weight of her reputation. It was the voice of someone who had been elevated as untouchable. The room knew this. They felt it in their bones. But then there was Jasmine Crockett, young, black, female, outspoken. She had walked into politics with fire, refusing to dull her, edges for the comfort of the establishment. Where others played cautious, she called out hypocrisy. Where others softened their tone to avoid being branded too much, Crockett leaned into her boldness. And for that, she was often dismissed, underestimated, or told she didn't fit the moment. That dismissal wasn't new. It was familiar. Because Crockett carried with her the same weight so many women, so many people of color, so many young leaders feel when they enter halls built to silence them. She represented a challenge to the idea that there's only one acceptable way to lead, one acceptable way to speak, one acceptable way to belong. In that chamber, Abrams and Crockett were not simply two individuals clashing. They embodied a deeper struggle within America's politics, the tension between old guard and new generation, between polished establishment authority and raw, unapologetic truth-telling. Abrams' command symbolized the instinct to silence. Crockett's steady composure symbolized the refusal to be erased. The stakes were generational. They were cultural. They were about more than just who spoke louder. They were about who would be heard. Every set of eyes in that room knew it. They weren't just witnessing a personal conflict. They were watching a referendum on power itself. Who decides who? Belongs in the fight for democracy? Who has the right to claim space? Who gets pushed out when they refuse to shrink? The silence after Abrams' outburst stretched into something larger than the room could contain. It was as if the entire political world was holding its breath, knowing this was not an ordinary clash. And yet Abrams had no idea her loudest command would spark the quietest and sharpest reply. Stacey Abrams did not stumble into politics. She carved her way in, piece by piece, until her name became synonymous with Democratic power. Her story was built on struggle and strategy. Born in Madison, Wisconsin, raised in Georgia, she carried the grit of the South into every fight. From state representative to Democratic leader in the Georgia House, she was the figure who managed to bridge local politics with national ambitions. By the time she ran for governor in 2018, Abrams had become a household name, a symbol of what determined organizing could achieve in the face of entrenched power. Her near victory against Brian Kemp that year turned her into something larger than a candidate. She became an idea, a narrative of unfinished business. The loss did not diminish her stature, it magnified it. Abrams harnessed the sting of defeat and redirected it into Fair Fight, the voting rights organization that redefined what grassroots mobilization could look like. Her work registered voters by the hundreds of thousands, fueling the eventual Democratic victories in Georgia that shocked the nation in 2020 and 2021. Without Abrams, many believed, there would have been no Biden presidency, no Democratic Senate majority. The media adored her. Articles crowned her as the mastermind behind the Georgia miracle. Profiles called her a visionary. She wasn't just a politician. She was cast as a liberator of democracy itself. Abrams moved through rooms with the aura of inevitability, her voice deep and deliberate, her language precise. To many, she embodied the perfect strategist, commanding, composed, able to play the long game while others stumbled. But that power came with a shadow. Those who worked near her often whispered about her dominance, not just in politics, but in presence. Abrams was known to control the room, to leave little air for those around her. Her reputation was not of cruelty, but of force. She carried herself as someone whose words were not to be doubted, whose authority was final. Her supporters saw this as strength. Her critics saw it as rigidity, an unwillingness to yield. This persona, commanding, near untouchable, meant she rarely faced public pushback from allies. When Abrams spoke, others usually deferred. When she directed, others followed. She had become, in essence, an institution within the Democratic Party, a figure whose clout was both admired and feared. And, like all institutions, she grew accustomed to being above challenge. For Abrams, silence often meant agreement. Her voice filled the void, and few dared to contradict her. That was how she had sustained her image as the queenmaker of Southern politics, unshaken, unquestioned, unchallenged. But it was also how blind spots formed. A persona built on domination risks forgetting the power of the unspoken. In the halls of Georgia's politics, Abrams' rise had been meteoric, but also tightly managed. She knew the importance of narrative and wielded it like a weapon. She was careful with her image, strategic with her moves, and relentless in her discipline. This was why she remained at the center of the national conversation years after her gubernatorial run. Few politicians could lose twice and still command headlines, speaking slots, and speculation about future campaigns. Abrams could. That was her power. And yet, inside that room, when her voice thundered with the command, "Get out!" Abrams believed she was enacting that same authority that had carried her this far. She believed the room would follow her, lead, that the silence which came after was proof of dominance. But silence is a dangerous thing. It does not always mean surrender. Sometimes it carries the weight of resistance, quiet but unbreakable. And that night, Abrams was about to learn a lesson no strategist had prepared her for. Even the most powerful voices falter when they mistake silence for weakness. Jasmine Crockett's story begins far from the spotlight. Raised in St. Louis, she grew up in a world that told young black girls like her to stay quiet, to be grateful, to wait their turn. But silence was never her destiny. She was drawn to questions of fairness and power from the start, the kind of child who saw injustice and asked, "Why is it allowed?" That instinct never left her. Law became her weapon. At the University of Houston Law Center, she sharpened her intellect into something sharper than a sword, an instrument of precision. She didn't just memorize statutes, she learned how to wield them in courtrooms where black clients were ignored, dismissed, or railroaded by systems stacked against them. Civil rights law wasn't an abstract principle for her. It was survival, for herself and for the people she represented. Crockett's practice became known for taking on the cases that others avoided. She defended protesters. She protected the marginalized. She stared down prosecutors who assumed intimidation would make her yield. Again and again, she refused to bend. She was dismissed as too fiery, too blunt, too bold for her own good. And yet, her record spoke for itself. Victories for those who had no other defender. From the courtroom, she moved into grassroots organizing, joining local fights over housing, policing, and education. She didn't enter politics with money or family connections. She entered with grit. In Dallas, where systemic inequities had deep roots, Crockett built her credibility by showing up. Where few politicians bothered, tenant meetings, rallies, neighborhood gatherings in overlooked districts. She wasn't polished for cameras, but she was trusted by people who had long been ignored. Her leap into the Texas House of Representatives wasn't backed by the establishment. Party leaders didn't rush to embrace her. She was, once again, underestimated, dismissed as too loud and too radical. But Crockett won anyway, and once in office, she became known for refusing to sit quietly in the corner. She challenged colleagues, called out hypocrisy, and defended her constituents with the same ferocity she had shown in the courtroom. When she ran for Congress, the whispers followed her. Too young, too brash, too untested. They said she hadn't paid her dues. They said she should wait her turn. But Crockett had spent her life hearing those words, and she had learned to transform them into fuel. Each dismissal only hardened her resolve. She understood something her detractors didn't. The people who wait their turn often never see it come. Her style was not bombast for its own sake. Crockett's true weapon was calm precision. She let others lose control while she held steady. In hearings, she became known for her ability to strip away the polish of witnesses and colleagues with pointed, fact-grounded questions that left no escape. Her voice rarely rose, but its steadiness cut deeper than shouting ever could. To many Americans, especially black women, young activists, and those who had been silenced by structures of power, Crockett became more than a politician. She became a mirror of their struggle. She was the embodiment of the millions who had been told to wait, to lower your voice, to be grateful, to get out. Every time she stood firm, every time she refused to shrink, she carried those voices with her. In Congress, she wore those expectations like armor. While critics sneered, supporters rallied. They saw her as proof that authenticity and courage could survive in a system that often crushed both. She didn't look or sound like the polished, careful leaders who spent decades climbing ladders. She looked and sounded like the people whose ladders had been kicked away, and that was exactly why she mattered. Crockett's journey was not just political. It was generational. For her, every victory represented a larger community still fighting, to be seen. For her, every confrontation was about more than egos. It was about survival and dignity. When she faced derision, she carried not just her own defiance but the weight of all who had been told they didn't belong. This was the essence of Jasmine Crockett. Not loudness, but steadiness. Not theatrics, but precision. A woman who had been forged in rooms where her presence was unwelcome, who had learned to stay seated even when told to leave. And so, when Abrams' command, "Get out!" rang through the room, Crockett did not flinch. She had heard versions of those words all her life. They no longer pierced her. They steeled her. She knew something Abrams did not. She knew that silence, when held with purpose, is stronger than the loudest shout. She knew that dignity could echo louder than rage, and on that stage, Crockett's calm would turn Abrams' roar into an echo. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. "Get out!" Abrams had barked, her hand still trembling from the force of its slam. The room should have shifted immediately to compliance. That was the way it usually went. Abrams spoke, and others moved. Her reputation carried weight, her authority seldom questioned. But on this night, something different stirred. When Crockett didn't rise, didn't shuffle away, didn't even blink, Abrams' eyes narrowed. Her voice sharpened, cutting through the uneasy silence. "I said get out." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. She expected obedience, not hesitation. For years, her tone had brokered no disagreement. She doubled down, leaning into the dominance that had defined her career. But the audience, felt the tremor beneath the surface. Murmurs rippled through the hall. It wasn't applause or laughter, not yet. It was a low hum of disbelief, of whispered commentary. Did she really just say that? To her? Why is she pushing it? Faces turned, eyes darted. A collective uncertainty. Crawling over the crowd, Crockett sat unmoved, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering. She didn't fumble with papers, didn't flinch or recoil. She let the silence stretch, and in doing so, she rewrote the balance of power in the room. Abrams' command, repeated now, didn't land with the same finality. It rang harsher, almost desperate against the backdrop of Crockett's calm refusal to give it oxygen. Abrams pushed further, her voice rising a half step, her cadence quicker. "This is not your place. If you can't respect this process, then leave." Each word was an escalation, a gamble that volume would succeed where authority seemed to be faltering. She sought to seize back control, but every repetition only sharpened the contrast. One woman raging, the other unshaken. Gasps punctuated the silence in waves. A woman in the second row clasped her hand to her mouth. A young man scribbled furiously in a notebook, already drafting the headline in his mind. Even Abrams' own allies shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with how the exchange was unfolding. They had cheered her before, yes, but now they looked uneasy, as though sensing the energy tilting against her. And still Crockett said nothing. She met Abrams' glare with a steady, unblinking gaze, the kind that carried weight without words. It was the stare of someone who had faced far worse than this, someone who had been told to sit down and step aside too many times to be rattled by it any more. Every second she held that silence, the room tightened further, the audience leaning, forward, waiting. The silence became unbearable for Abrams. She pressed again, her voice now edged with incredulity. "Did you not hear me? I said get out." Her words cracked, not in sound, but in authority. What had once been ironclad now felt brittle, like glass straining under pressure. The whispers in the room grew louder, no longer fully hushed. Some exchanged glances that seemed to ask the same question. Why isn't she moving? Why isn't she backing down? Others leaned in, sensing that something extraordinary was taking shape before them. Crockett let it build. The tension, the murmurs, the unspoken question. She had been here before, not in this exact room, not in this exact clash, but in battles, where people with louder voices tried to erase her presence. And she had learned that silence, held just long enough, could be the sharpest blade of all. Seconds stretched like minutes. Abrams' hand tightened against the table again, her frustration visible. She had won many fights through force of will, through the sheer magnitude of her presence. But tonight, the usual tools seemed to dull in her hands. She could raise her voice, she could repeat the command, but she could not bend the woman sitting across from her. And then, just as the crowd's whispers threatened to spill into open chatter, Crockett inhaled, slow, deliberate, steady. Her shoulders lifted, her lips parted, her eyes locked on Abrams with a clarity that cut through the noise. The room froze again, every ear tilted forward, and then, in a single breath, Crockett unleashed the reply no one saw coming. The pause lingered, like a drum roll. Crockett's inhale was soft, controlled, but it rippled through the room as though the very walls recognized the shift in gravity. For one breath, for one heartbeat, the air itself belonged to her. Abrams' command still reverberated faintly in the audience's ears. "Get out!" But it was no longer dominant. It had become the setup for something greater. Crockett's voice emerged low, steady, unshaken. "With all due respect," she began, each word crisp, measured. "I've heard that command before. Not from you, Miss Abrams, but from systems, from halls, from voices that thought I didn't belong." Her tone was not fiery. It was clear, unflinching, so calm it almost startled. The audience leaned forward. Gasps hushed into silence again. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't snapped back. But in that moment, her composure was louder than Abrams' shout had ever been. She let the silence work for her, pausing just long enough to make every eye cling to her. Then came the reveal, the turn of the blade. "When you tell me to leave this table," she continued, her gaze steady on Abrams, "you're not just speaking to me. You're echoing every voice that's tried to shut out women like me. Voices that said, 'You're too young, too bold, too black, too unpolished.'" A ripple of reaction surged through the crowd, murmurs of agreement, subtle nods, a collective awareness dawning. Crockett hadn't made it personal. She had made it universal. What Abrams thought was a flex of authority had just been reframed as elitism, as the silencing of a new generation. Abrams blinked, the steel in her posture faltering for the briefest second. She had expected resistance, maybe even anger, but not this. Not the kind of calm that stripped her command of its force. Crockett pressed on, her cadence sharpening with each phrase, her tone still composed but rising in clarity. "The truth is, I'm not leaving, because I've spent my life walking into rooms where I wasn't invited, standing at tables where someone told me I didn't deserve a seat, and every time I stayed. Not for me, but for those who come after." The audience erupted in scattered applause, then hushed again, eager for more. Crockett's words were surgical, dismantling Abrams' dominance piece by piece. Each line didn't just defend her presence. It questioned the very legitimacy of the command that had been thrown at her. She leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, but firm, her voice steady as stone. "You can raise your voice. You can slam the table. But force is not leadership. Exclusion is not power. And telling someone to get out doesn't make them small. It only shows fear of what they might bring in." The gasps were audible this time. A woman in the third row clapped once, involuntarily, before catching herself. Heads nodded in unison, shoulders straightened as if sharing in Crockett's calm defiance. The words didn't just hit Abrams. They resonated with the audience, with everyone who had ever felt dismissed, silenced, or told to step aside. Abrams shifted uncomfortably. The authority that had once been unquestioned now looked shaky. She attempted a half smile, a controlled expression, but the edges of her composure had frayed. For the first time, she wasn't the gravitational center of the room. Crockett continued, her voice unwavering. If this table is truly about progress, then it can't be guarded by gatekeepers. It must be open, even to those who make us uncomfortable, especially to those voices, because history doesn't change when the powerful say, "Stay out." It changes when the silenced refuse to leave. Applause erupted, louder this time, spreading in waves. It wasn't polite clapping, it was cathartic, born of recognition. Some rose to their feet, others shouted, "That's right!" The sound filled the hall, drowning out any attempt to pull it back into order. And yet Crockett didn't ride the wave of noise. She waited. She let it crest and settle, standing motionless, poised. When the applause dimmed, her final words came, low but resonant. "So, no, Miss Abrams, I will not get out, because my place here isn't granted by your permission. It's earned by every person who came before me, and secured by every person who will follow." For a heartbeat, the hall was silent again, the words hanging like scripture. Then, the eruption returned, this time unstoppable. The audience was on its feet, cheering, clapping, some even stomping. Cameras flashed, phones shot upward to capture the moment. Hashtags were being born in real time, and Abrams, once the undeniable force, the queenmaker, the giant of the stage, looked suddenly small. Her jaw tightened, her eyes darted, her attempt at composure slipping into something unmistakably human, vulnerability. She had been upstaged not by a louder voice, but by a calmer truth. The power dynamic was inverted. Abrams had shouted, Crockett had spoken, and the people had chosen which voice carried the weight of leadership. What had begun as a command to silence had become a platform for defiance. The very act of telling Crockett to get out had opened the door for her to walk through more powerfully than ever. Dignity had trumped shouting. Truth had outshone force. Calm had dismantled arrogance. But the real shock wasn't in what she said. It was in how the entire nation responded. The moment Crockett's final words echoed into silence, it was as if a spark had been thrown into dry brush. Within minutes, clips of her reply flooded social media. Phones that had captured the exchange uploaded the footage before Abrams could even collect herself. Hashtags blazed into life. Crockett clapped back, Hawk Abrams backfire, Hawk unshaken. What had been? A confrontation inside one hall became the nation's newest viral storm. On TikTok, the clip looped endlessly. Crockett's calm expression, Abrams' faltering command, the eruption of applause. Users stitched it with captions like, "Dignity," "Volume," and "This is leadership." On X, the 15-second moment trended at the top. She didn't even flinch. Memes were everywhere. Side-by-side images of Abrams slamming the table and Crockett's unshaken stare, captioned simply, "Power versus Poise." YouTube reaction videos multiplied by the hour. Progressive commentators hailed it as the new standard, for grace under fire. Conservative pundits, usually quick to mock Crockett, admitted begrudging respect. One viral comment read, "This wasn't politics, it was a masterclass in composure." Celebrities joined the chorus. A Grammy-winning artist tweeted, "That's how you handle disrespect. Silence, strength, and then truth." A popular actor posted the clip on Instagram with the caption, "Every young woman needs to see this. This is power." Even seasoned politicians, some with no love for Crockett, acknowledged the undeniable shift. Meanwhile, Abrams' camp scrambled. Spokespeople tried to spin it. The moment was misunderstood, they said. Some claimed Abrams was frustrated, not dismissive, but the narrative had already been written, and it wasn't theirs to control anymore. For the first time in years, Abrams' commanding presence had been overshadowed by someone else's restraint. Cable news ran the footage on repeat. Analysts debated what it meant for the Democratic Party, for generational power, for women in leadership. "We've just witnessed a changing of the guard," one commentator declared. Another said, "Abrams' roar turned into an echo, and Crockett's calm filled the silence." Crockett herself didn't need to issue long statements. She posted only one line on her official account: "I'm not leaving." The post racked up millions of likes in less than 24 hours. For her supporters, and for many who had never paid her much attention before, it was more than defiance. It was declaration. Suddenly, Crockett wasn't just a politician from Texas. She was a symbol of resilience, the embodiment of every person who had been told to leave but refused. She became shorthand for dignity in the face of disrespect, a cultural touchstone overnight. And Abrams? The woman once heralded as untouchable, the master strategist, now found herself trending for all the wrong reasons. The incident wasn't remembered as her strong moment. It was remembered as her misstep, the instant she underestimated someone she thought she could command. But the impact stretched beyond headlines and hashtags. In living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces, people replayed the clip not just to marvel, but to discuss. Parents showed it to daughters. Community leaders used it to talk about persistence. Young activists shared it as proof that you don't have to shout to be heard. You only need truth spoken with calm certainty. The clash had birthed a cultural parable, one bigger than the two women themselves. And yet, beyond the memes, beyond the trending tags, beyond the roaring applause, one thing lingered heavier than all the rest: the deeper lesson America couldn't ignore. When the applause faded and the hashtags began to cool, the real meaning of Crockett's reply settled into the nation's conscience. What she had offered was not a clapback for the sake of ego, not a personal strike at Abrams, not even a claim to power in the traditional sense. It was something far deeper. It was a lesson. Her response reminded everyone watching that true strength is not measured in decibels, but in composure. Abrams had thundered. Crockett had whispered. And yet, it was Crockett's whisper that echoed longer, clearer, louder in the minds of millions. Power, Crockett showed, is not the roar that fills a room for a fleeting second. It's the dignity that endures when the noise dies away. This was not about two women clashing. It was about what happens when an old style of politics, one that confuses dominance for leadership, collides with the new. For decades, politics has rewarded the loudest voice, the sharpest elbows, the command to sit down or get out. But Crockett's stillness, her refusal to bend or break, exposed a truth that resonated far beyond that debate stage. America's future does not belong to the gatekeepers. It belongs to the voices they try to silence. Crockett stood that night for every young person told they were too much or out of place. She stood for every immigrant family instructed to go back. She stood for every woman in every room who had been interrupted, dismissed, or ordered to leave, only to stay and prove their worth tenfold. Her victory was not in humiliating Abrams, but in revealing a universal truth: the underestimated, the overlooked, the unheard. These are the voices shaping tomorrow. And so the moment stretched beyond the political. It became cultural. It became spiritual. People saw themselves in Crockett's silence, her steadiness, her refusal to be moved. They saw that it is possible to hold your ground without raising your volume. They saw that sometimes the sharpest sword is restraint, the greatest weapon is composure, and the most devastating blow is simply refusing to disappear. In Crockett's reply, America caught a glimpse of the politics of tomorrow, not ruled by fear, not dictated by hierarchy, not controlled by those who slam tables and bark orders, but by those who bring truth without theatrics, by those who know that leadership is not domination, but service, by those who carry within them the quiet fire of conviction. It was never about Abrams' words alone. It was about what those words symbolized: The old impulse to police who belongs, and who doesn't. And it was about Crockett's refusal to play by those rules. In choosing calm over conflict, dignity over defensiveness, she demonstrated that the politics of tomorrow will not be about who shouts the loudest, but who speaks the clearest. This wasn't just a viral moment, one commentator said. It was a glimpse of the politics of tomorrow. And they were right. For in that instant, America saw that the future doesn't belong to the ones slamming their fists on tables. It belongs to those who stand firm, unshaken, and remind us all that belonging is not granted by permission. It is claimed by presence. And as the nation replayed her words, Crockett's voice seemed to carry a promise, not just to Abrams, but to anyone who ever felt pushed aside. We are not leaving. We are here, and we are the future. From the instant Abrams' hand struck the table and the words, "Get out," ripped through the room, it seemed the story was set. Power had spoken, and silence would follow. But instead, history bent in the other direction. Because Jasmine Crockett did not leave. She did not retreat. She answered, not with fury, not with venom, but with composure that turned a command into a lesson. Her reply is now etched in the memory of millions, not because it was loud, but because it was lasting. Abrams' shout may have rattled the room for a moment, but Crockett's calm reverberated far beyond those walls. It reached into homes, into feeds, into hearts, proving once again that shouting crumbles, but calm endures. That is the moral clarity we take away tonight. This wasn't about one clash. It was about a reminder that dignity has a longer shelf life than arrogance, and truth will always outshine theatrics. Crockett showed that belonging is not granted by gatekeepers. It's claimed by those who refuse to step aside. And if this moment left you shaken, inspired, or even speechless, know this: it is only the beginning. The voices once told to get out are not going anywhere. They are walking in, standing firm, and reshaping the very ground beneath American politics. So if you want to keep witnessing history in the making, if you want the explosive takedowns, the viral confrontations, the unforgettable clashes where truth always finds its voice, then this is your place. Subscribe to State Shock now, because the next moment, the next reply, the next viral shift could happen any day. And when it does, you'll want to be here to see it first.